I think of them as nouns. They are things. They're things that you're plopping into the chord. So I'm going to put rolls into this tune. I'm going to put drops in this tune. I'm going to put flips. To me, they are things. So they're nouns. To me, these enclosures, we're talking about decorating the idioms. Those I think of as adjectives. I have a friend who thinks of them as prefixes and suffixes, which also makes sense. So to me, that was just it was either a roll with a very decorated beginning and end, or it was a flip, with a decorated beginning. You're decorating. So I think of it as enclosures and neighboring tones and things like that as adjectives. Okay, they're describing. They're saying it's a green. It's giving more detail to whatever that noun is. And then verbs to me are like scales. So if I was just to play through the tune. So to me, the scales, things like the chromatic scale, the chromatic bebop scale, or the bebop scale, they're ways of getting from one idiom to another. So I might go. So that's an idiom. Now let's say I want to get to another idiom. I use the chromatic bebop scale to get to the next idiom on the following chord. So to me, scales, specifically like the bebop scales, and maybe some of the other scales, like the diminished scale, something like that, is just a way to get from one idiom to another. So when you start to put all that together, okay, that would be a thing. And then that would be a thing. Now I can decorate each of those. So now I've kind of used the enclosure to be an adjective. Now my next idiom is here. Now, so I'm thinking about how can I get from here to here using some kind of bebop scale. There, so that was kind of a decoration to the idiom. So an adjective and a noun. All I'm doing is just kind of, getting, having some motion with an enclosure around, so there was adjective, noun, verb, adjective. Okay, decorated. Okay, so, but the whole phrase. So I must admit, though, in my own mind, I'm not thinking play a noun, play a verb, play an adjective, or even make a sentence or make, it's just, that's how I sort of categorize these different kinds of things as to what their behavior pattern is. I could play an entire solo of verbs. It would sound kind of funny. In fact, that's maybe a thing to talk about. What's the problem with thinking only idioms or only scales or only in the adjectives or in the enclosures? If I play only idioms, I'm going to sound like this. It's almost as like someone who's just putting a sentence together with only nouns. Dog, cat, building, so on and so forth. If I just play only scales, it sounds something like this. that, right? So that just sounds like I'm just running. I'm just running around the chords. I mean, it sounds better than just arpeggiating the chords, but still, you're not really. There's nothing of any substance. So when you combine the two. Just that right there already sounds a lot better. I'm using an idiom. I'm using a little bit of a scale to get to the next one, which is kind of a noun. So it's a combination. So to me, depending on how you practice and how much detail you want to get into this practice, practicing idioms around the tune, practicing the scales around the tune, and practicing and closing around all the chord tones around the tune are good things to practice, but they would not be good things to perform. They would just be getting your craft ready so that when you're ready to improvise, you've got all of these skills ready to go so that you can improvise extemporaneously using any and all of them.
Yeah, but for people who are like starting a roll, all three of those sound the same. All idioms, all scales, and good improvising, probably all just sound like jazz. You know.
You mean someone that isn't an informed jazz listener? Yeah. They haven't listened. It just all sounds like, well, they're just messing around. Correct. And so that's the thing that I've had many discussions with someone who, to a person that speaks English, listening to two people speaking Chinese, if one person speaks eloquent and fluent Chinese and the other one speaks Chinese in very poor formulated sentences, or however they speak Chinese, because I don't speak Chinese, a person speaking English would have no clue which one's good and which one's bad. It just all sounds foreign. So that is important. But to an informed jazz listener, there's certain things that they start to, especially an informed jazz listener from an insider perspective, someone who's actually tried to learn how to speak a language and put it together on their instrument, whatever that is. You start to hear things that do sound idiomatic, and like the things that jazz players play and the things that we use in our sentence structure and the way we communicate and sort of the lingo that we use and that kind of stuff. And then there's things that we don't. I mean, I could improvise, maybe to an uninformed jazz listener that sounded fine. I mean, wow, you sound pretty good. But to an informed jazz listener, it's like, well, there was nothing idiomatic. There was lots of bad notes put on wrong chord tones. It didn't swing particularly well. I mean, all those kind of things, So to really play jazz that informed listeners and other jazz musicians, are used to hearing, some time spent on all of this, voicing of the chords and learning some idiomatic ideas and learning how to implement them. I guess I should say also that, of course, not every jazz musician learns how to improvise in this way. This is a way of improvising that is very much stylistic from about the 40s, the late 30s, the swing period, the bebop period, hard boppers, some of the cool school, if I can mention some names, people like Bud Powell, Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Clifford Brown, early Freddie Hubbard, even some of the late swing guys, people like Oscar Peterson, use a lot of these idiomatic figures, and that was sort of what I call the King's English from which a lot of the more modern players came. But everybody learns how to improvise in such a different way. I mean, there's many jazz musicians who just learn to play by listening and playing a lot. There's some that transcribe a lot of solos and try to derive things out of significant and historically important jazz solos, and they incorporate those things into their playing. There's some people that are entirely play by ear, and they have great ears, and they can pick up all this stuff by ear. There's some people that don't. They need to do it very analytically. Some people practice just by sitting down and jamming for hours. Some people need to have extremely structured practice. I mean, for anybody I've ever talked to about how do you become a great improviser, no two people have ever given me the same answer. So this is just one approach. The thing that I've noticed with some of my students is they may learn their scales, they may learn their chords, they may do lots of listening to jazz jazz they may transcribe, but still when they sit down to improvise, they're not playing anything that has lots of the things that jazz players are used to hearing in that particular era of jazz, that about good 50-year history of jazz. You know, some of the things that jazz players, just like people speaking English, we're used to hearing certain things, certain sentence structure, certain pacing in our sentences, certain ways of communicating, certain things that we say that are redundancies, you know. And, you know, I just said it, I said, you know, and then I said, you know. I mean, I said it again. There's certain things that we're used to hearing and certain idiomatic passages, and this is just giving you a few of those. Not that you have to, because there's great players that have evolved and don't use any of these anymore. Just like there's great orators that use no idiomatic or create their own idiomatic phrases in their own language. That's really what it gets to be about. What will you eventually create that will identify you, if we get that far, as speaking in your own eloquent way of improvising on these chords? Or do you even play standards anymore? I mean, do you even play on these type of chords? You know, I mean, this is Great American Songbook type of stuff, but jazz has evolved even at this point to not being a lot of Great Americans. But jazz, as most jazz players know it, and as lay people understand it, and that certain body of musicians that we know as great jazz musicians play these kinds of tunes.
And the great orators that are making their own idiomatic phrases usually have somewhat mastered the...
Generally, yes. I mean, yeah. I mean, even the great younger players, if you ask them to play a standard, they would be able to play a standard very well. They might not play bebop the way that Charlie Parker played bebop, but they play something that sounds like it has a good feel, and you know, has some certain kinds of rhythmic kinds of things that are very consistent within a lot of jazz. You know, and then now, but they're doing other things that are more informed by more modern styles of music, even non-jazz styles of music, alternative rock and hip hop and all that kind of stuff is really making its way into a lot of what younger jazz musicians would draw upon to create music that we might now call jazz. This is just something that gets us more to the basic level. I mean, you know, if you equate it to like classical music, I mean, this is sort of like learning about Bach four-part chorales, or, you know, the very basics of harmony, or the basics of good melodic construction. I mean, something that even if you're going to write a very obscure piece of atonal classical music, it's good in your training at one point or another to learn how other types of music were formed and what made Beethoven or Mozart or Haydn or Schubert or any of those people, what were good melodies, you know, what are some of the things that were there, and what of that do we want to continue to carry on in that tradition, and what of that do we want to now break away from.